Welcome, everyone. We're about to start in just a few minutes. We still have participants entering. So welcome to everyone. You're in the December forum for the League of Women Voters, Seattle King County. Thank you all for coming in this busy holiday season. I'm Mac Mitchell, chair of the League's Environmental Committee and the moderator for tonight's webinar entitled Regional Climate Action Through Democratic Sustainability. We have posted an agenda on the opening slide, and just quickly, I'm framing the issues followed by a King County speaker, and then a panel of 4 of our climate action guides, and then 2 experts from the city of Shoreline, a climate guide and a person who works in their environmental services area. So let's get started. Next slide. So everyone, the way things begin has everything to do about the way they turn out. So tonight we're presenting the storyline sequentially to you of how we are activating 20 cities in King County towards a more democratic engagement about climate goals with their diverse communities. Our work is in the early stages, but our storyline will project into the future with a live case study. We will address these 3 primary questions. Are cities the units of regional climate action? What do democratically engaged cities actually look like? And are network cities essential? Next. We began our quest by looking at data, and the first piece of data that the county showed us that impressed us was this piece. It's a diagram of the carbon emission reduction goals for King County, starting in 2007, going to 2020. You've got about 13 years there. And if you look carefully at it, we had projected the blue line dropping to 75% from the 100% emissions that we started with over those 13 years. But if you look at the orange line, it shows you what actually happened. And the orange line shows you a flat sort of carbon emission rating of very close to 100% all the way across. And that's what was the call to arms for a lot of the environmentalists and for our committee. So what's happening there is what we decided we would explore. Next. And because we know that there was a current system in place, we decided to look carefully at it. And here is our reasoning. Our reasoning was that all systems are perfectly designed to produce the results they're getting, right? Now, if you don't like the results you're getting. If you're not satisfied with the flat emission results that registered in 2019, after 13 years of money, time, and energy being spent on issues through the county and the city. But if you're not satisfied, which nobody was, then you have to change the design of the system dramatically. And so we embarked on a way to diagnose and address the root causes of the problem. And we knew that, next slide, please. We knew that growth in King County was a major issue. And what happens when you have a lot of quick growth is that the growth offsets any reductions that you make in carbon emissions, and you end up with a flat profile. But that's an ongoing problem. It's not going to change, and we have to accept it as a given. But we also went on and looked at the democratic engagement that was going on in the cities. And we found that although it was well-intentioned, that the impact was low. And there were three things that we discovered. Number one, the percent of engaged people from the general public was extremely low. Most of the cities were running their climate plans based on input from a small group of climate advocates, usually from nonprofits, universities, et cetera, but not the general public. So that was a big finding. And then the degree of involvement for the most impacted people in the city was low. And so climate equity was not being pursued in a strong way. And then the last thing we found out was that the outreach that the cities were using were really not designed for behavior change. Instead, they asked for input, they sent out surveys, and there were some low-level ways that people could participate. But in one or two cities, we actually saw them engage the public in workshops and in challenges to change their human behaviors and cause them to ratchet up their belief system about climate change. And we know that it takes that in order to get a public to take on bigger policy issues and vote for large statewide legislation like a potential carbon tax, for instance. So, and then one other thing we noticed is the solar city work was happening consistently, even though there was people were trying to create some networks. So the K4C agreements from King County were terrific. They were provided a baseline. Different cities entered into K4C agreements whereby they committed to certain climate goals and climate actions. They sort of vouched for their commitment. And that's about half of the cities in King County. However, the cities continue to operate in mostly solo and autonomous ways. And also the Growth Management Act, which they were working under, still does not require them to file publicly a climate action plan. That may get revised in this year's legislative session because the League is pursuing a revision on a whole bunch of issues in the Growth Management Act. So we're hoping that that will change. But that was our analysis. These are the things we found out that we decided we were going to address. Next slide. So this is a slide borrowed from King County. And the reason I'm showing it is mainly because the green circle represents all the carbon emissions coming out of the 39 cities. And it accounts for energy use, transportation, waste disposal, everything. The small gray section is King County government operations, and their emissions are much, much smaller. Now, we have a very proactive county who has set amazing goals for themselves, and they're very strong systemic thinkers. So I'm pretty sure they're going to meet their goals. But the place where we knew we had to put our energy was in the city. And you can see how powerful those cities are in generating emissions and also declining emissions if they become powerful through some of these processes. Next slide. So we asked the question, now that we've done this analysis, we sort of went slow in the beginning. It took us months to figure this out. So we went slow to go fast. So then we started speeding up and we said, well, we will engage a resident volunteer from the Environment Committee, who is a League of Women Voter climate guide with each city. And we were successful in finding matches in 20 cities that are the medium and large cities responsible for 70 to 80% of the carbon emissions.
1 minute.
And then we offered to address democratic engagement. We said, we'll help you with democratic engagement. We'll help you with equity and climate justice. We'll educate for action and behavioral change, and we'll introduce a regional network change of exchange. So those were the 4 offers that we made. Next slide. And when we went into the cities, we brought a letter for credibility from Melissa Weed, our president. And she, in one sentence, said it all. She said, League of Women Voter climate guides can ensure your climate change results through democratic and equitable processes and systemic cross-sharing structures, which are networks that are uniquely positioned to support your city. So that is, next slide. I'm going to be introducing you now. That's sort of the overview it gives you. And now I want to introduce to you one of our primary partner, Rachel Bombau, who is Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives. She works in the Office of King County Executive Dow Constantine. And also she's the program lead on the development of the Climate Action Toolkit, which she will be explaining tonight. She had the vision and foresight to support this collaboration, which is unusual. And our relationship and our work has developed in tandem with hers at the county. So Rachel, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Mac, for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this forum tonight. And I'm excited by the continued support of the League of Women Voters for the Climate Action Toolkit as one means to reach our countywide shared greenhouse gas emission goals that protect the health of residents and the natural environment of King County. Next slide, please. I'd like to start out with a short quote from Executive Constantine. You know, of course, the executive is a climate champion and sees the role of the county to set ambitious goals to protect the health and well-being of residents and our natural environment and to hold people accountable. So he says, the Climate Action Toolkit will help mobilize cities throughout King County, uniting our efforts to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare our region for climate impacts. And that aligns with our 2020 strategic climate action goals that both we want to reduce carbon emissions by half by the end of the decade, prepare for impacts, and also lead with climate equity. So I am very thankful to have strong leadership at the county and also at the municipal levels. I'll speak to that in a minute. Next slide, please. You know, another role of the county is to convene the King County's City Climate Collaboration, which Mac mentioned very briefly. It's a voluntary but formal partnership of 16 cities, the county, and the Port of Seattle working together to reach the shared countywide emission targets of 50% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So this coalition represents 80% of the county's total population, so a very significant amount. We are always looking to have 100%, and that is a goal. But the King County's Climate Collaboration, or the K4C for short, provides a forum for sharing information and best practices to reach our goals. And it's no surprise that many of these same cities, of course, are the ones that the League is seeking to work in partnership with the climate guides. So just to, you know, as a little bit more context, the executive convenes a work session twice a year and invites all elected officials from King County, all mayors, all council members, to attend, whether or not they're a member of the K4C. And so I just wanted to, and those are occasions to talk about best practices, talk about activities that we can do both individually, where cities and local jurisdictions have impact and influence, but also how to work together. So just I show a picture here of a photo from, I believe this is October 2019, which is the last time we met in person. Clearly our meetings in 2020 were online. You can also see in the circle here that we have our King County government operations goals, and Max showed that that chart, that pie graph a couple minutes ago that showed we do in our operations have a very small sliver, but we see our role as leading by example. And so if you'll note, our goals are even more aggressive than the county-wide goals. We've accelerated the reduction in emissions by 5 years for the 50% goal and 20 years for the 80% goal. And actually we're doing really well on the goals that we can control 100%. Next slide, please. So Max showed this slide, and I'm so glad. And this is something that sometimes I'm not super happy to show this slide because it doesn't show the trajectory on carbon emissions that we want to see. But I'm also really proud of how transparent we are about our progress and how we are constantly seeking to figure out how to change that trajectory and learn from what's not working, what is working, and continue to try to change that curve here. So you can see on this graph here, we do have very sharp countywide, and that is cities, residents, county operations, all these in together are our emissions. We are targeting a 25% reduction by 2020, a 50% reduction by 2030, and a 80% reduction by 2050. And you can see that indeed, we are not hitting that. On the flip side, there is a little bit of a silver lining. We've stopped the growth of emissions. And a lot of analysis, we don't have time to go into it tonight. We've done a lot of analysis on what is driving that emissions, the increase in emissions. And the biggest factors are the increase in population growth and the associated construction and economic activity that follows that. 2020 has been an odd year for many reasons, but through 2010 through 2019 really showed sharp growth in that type of activity, and we kept our emissions flat. So that's a real success story in one way to decouple emissions with that economic growth. Nonetheless, the toolkit will support cities in their efforts, and this is a new effort to help to move that bar down along the path that we want it to go. It'll help support cities in their efforts to reduce emissions for both their own operations, the operations of city government, and at the community scale. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about what are the main goals of the toolkit. So first of all, the first goal was to measure. We want to lead with data, as we do in everything, and make educated estimates and try to be really impactful. So what it will do is it will identify resources so cities can conduct emissions inventories. I'll show you a detailed emissions inventory from King County in just a minute. It does not do the emissions inventory for the city, although that's something that we're talking about at the K4C, but it provides resources and guides on how to identify what your emissions are. Then it provides guidance on how to manage those emissions. So it provides a lot of actions and strategies to meet the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals that you establish. And one of the things that we really deliberately did in the toolkit was to put in actions that fit different population size and density, and also financial and staff capacity to enact. A lot of smaller and mid-sized cities do not have a large full-time climate staff. They just simply don't have the tax base to support that. So we wanted to reduce that barrier and make it easier for staff and elected officials to pick this up and able to run with it. It also helps elected officials and and staff to understand some of the other co-benefits. Transit clearly reduces carbon emissions from cars taken off the road, but it provides mobility for folks that might not be able to drive. So things like that. And then last, it provides a lot of resources supporting community engagement. And that, I know that's really important to the League. And that was really important to both the development of the toolkit, but how you want to go about and create your climate action plan. It's just really essential that community be involved at every step of the way so that they have buy-in to the process and feel ownership of the goals, and it's not seen as something top down from the local jurisdiction. There's also resources on implementation and on reporting. Next slide, please. Yeah, I mentioned this on the last slide. So this is a more detailed inventory of the countywide emissions that in the slide that Max showed, the big green wedge comprised most of the 20 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that are emitted in the county that were emitted in 2017. So this is something that a city could use this as a proxy if they didn't have the capacity, either financial or staff, to develop their own emissions inventory. And you can see here that transportation is, as a standalone, is the largest source of emissions, but the built environment also, from residential buildings and commercial buildings, comprises a very, very large percentage of emissions. Every city will have something slightly different. Some cities may have an older building stock that may create more emissions, or their fuel mix from their utility provider may impact that, or they may have a newer building stock. So it just really depends on the unique geography and demographics of every city. So we are updating our inventory for the countywide emissions for 2019, and it could be used as a proxy for a city, although every jurisdiction will have something slightly different. As I mentioned, the K4C is looking at some funding to see if we could provide a very baseline greenhouse gas emissions inventory for all members. So that would be something that might be attractive to cities that are not currently members of the K4C. So anyway, next slide, please. Let's talk about managing emissions. So the toolkit, which is readily available on the website link that I'll show at the end of this presentation, is a document that you can download, has hyperlinks that you can look at. But it really talks about some key things. I've talked a little bit about an inventory, but if you look on the third dot down, it really talks about developing goals, how to figure out what you're looking for, and you want to make them smart, measurable and actionable and reportable. There are hundreds of recommended climate actions, and these are pulled from research on best practices and other local, national climate plans, and developed in coordination with stakeholder outreach, and I'll speak to that in a little bit more. Has best practices for implementation, how to manage your metrics and report on them. And again, as always, communication, outreach, and engagement. How do you engage the residents in your jurisdiction? How do you get input from them? How do you get them to work with you on reducing carbon emissions and making their city a better place to go? There's appendices also on funding and other resources and other types of organizations that can support. Next slide, please. Let's talk about engagement, how the toolkit was created. So you can see from the fun Zoom slide there that all of our outreach was online because of 2020. But we tried really hard to have a diversity of voices for the toolkit to help develop that. And that's something I'd really recommend any local jurisdiction seeking to develop a plan, is to really try to address that diversity issue and create an outreach that gets as many people as possible as you can. I know right now, sometimes that is a little challenging, and that was something that we really grappled with, and I'm happy with how it turned out despite some of the limitations that we had. But how we created the toolkit was there was, as I mentioned, there was extensive research from leading organizations to develop a long list of potential actions. There was no need to reinvent the wheel there. So we looked at plans from King County and other local jurisdictions, and they're referenced in the guide. We looked at leading organizations such as ICLEI, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and C40 cities, and looked at all of this for best practices. Then we had input and guidance from the K4C and King County staff. We wanted to make sure that it aligned with both the Strategic Climate Action Plan goals and our county-wide goals and targets that the K4C has established in its joint commitments. We also need, because we have so many cities in the K4C, we wanted to make sure that this was something that would work for the K4C and for the staff and electeds in there. And then lastly, and really most importantly, we had contributions from nearly 150 stakeholders representing really diverse perspectives. We had public focus group workshops. We had several very large public focus group workshops. We had several small group workshops, including those from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and also a youth workshop one evening, which was really, really interesting and informative, talking about what the youth, these were mostly high school students, saw as their role in leading on the climate crisis. And then we also had a public input tool survey, which was something on, we had hosted a site where we had several hundred responses from those folks who were unable to attend another type of workshop. So that was really informative. So we pulled all of that into the final document. Next slide, please.
1 minute.
Thank you. I want to speak real briefly about the themes. It comes as no surprise that there were calls for investment in programs to accelerate the conversion to no and low carbon options in all sectors. That was very clear. There were calls for increased resident education, calls for equity. Very clearly, climate justice is racial justice. And then an understanding on how to prioritize actions and a strong linkage between climate action and job creation. K4C elected officials were briefed on this in early October, so we brought these messages forward to them. And then next slide, please. Last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about next steps. So this has been transmitted to the King County Council at the end of September. Right now, we are working on outreach to cities and partners. We're doing a lot of presentations and briefings, working very closely with MAC and the Environmental Committee and the climate guides to focus on democratic engagement. And we're also creating a bunch of training videos, both get oriented to the toolkit, but also to there's an Excel tool that can support your decision making. In early 2021, the council will hear and deliberate on the toolkit, and then post passage, we will continue to roll it out with partners. Of course, we would love additional support. The league has been very supportive, and we would love support while it is in council. So, let me know if you have any questions on that and how you could support. And here's the link to the website. As I mentioned, it's available now. You can download it and you can download the tool and check back probably closer to the end of the month or maybe at the beginning of January for a bunch of training videos that should be available. Next slide, please. And last but not least, here's my contact information. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I don't know, Mac, do we have time for a few questions?
I have a few. A lot of questions about K4C came up. People don't understand what it is. Can you give a brief explanation?
Yeah, so the K4C is that voluntary but formal coalition of the county, the Port of Seattle, and 16 cities. You could look on, we have a K4C website, And we work together on shared goals, and they're in different sectors, like transportation goals to reduce vehicle miles traveled and promote electric vehicles, in the built environment to promote renewable electricity supplies and efficiency. But we pledge to work together on climate, and it's really an innovative structure. We have not seen it in any other places. We got an EPA award for this several years ago just because of the innovation. Usually jurisdictions don't really pull together on this. Staff meets about once a month, and the elected officials meet twice a year. I actually host a group of other elected officials that are have additional time and interest, and we're really active during the legislative session to advocate for pro-climate legislation during the state sessions.
Great. Another question that I got is there funding or small grants available for cities to work on?
You know, that's a really great question, and I know funding is always an issue. That's you know, an emissions inventory can cost several $1,000s to actually several tens of thousands of dollars, kind of depending on what level you do it. That's one of the reasons we're looking to see if we can support through kind of a bulk buy process at the K4C to support getting maybe not the emissions inventory that goes out to 3 decimal points, but good a high quality emissions inventory that for each city within there to eliminate that barrier.
Great. And another question is exactly how will the toolkit increase public engagement in the cities? I think what this person was wondering is, you've done a great job on getting public engagement into the design of the toolkit and the SCAP, but specifically as the cities don't seem to have the capacity to involve their general public and haven't been focused too much on the impacted people who are impacted most by some of the carbon emission work. So how would you recommend that cities move ahead on public engagement?
Great question. Let me add one quick response to the previous question about grants. In the appendix, there is a full appendix on grant and loan opportunities. Obviously, this is a live document and things change, but there is something in the appendix that one could look for funding opportunities. Back to public engagement, you know, that's one area where both we're doing push and pull. So working with a staff, particularly in the K4C, but also working really closely with our partners. So for example, you know, we're working with the League to spread the word. We're also working with the Sierra Club who's interested in this. People for Climate Action, which I'm sure folks are familiar with, are very interested in the toolkit. So there's a lot of groups that have interest in helping to spread the word about this. And this is part of the outreach that we're doing now and that we'll continue to do once the toolkit has been available and really ready to go out.
Great.
Perhaps one more question.
The question, the last one is, what about school district buildings? They cross district jurisdictions and cross city boundaries. Who will take care of their carbon emissions? Is that county? Is it the school district? Is it the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the toolkit was really scoped to address cities. However, a lot of the actions, so many of the actions in the toolkit could be applied to school districts also. They can also apply for grants to upgrade their facilities and to make them more efficient, grants for bus electrification and things like that. So just because it says city doesn't mean that other kind of other jurisdictions couldn't take advantage of it. And I hope that they do.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've got that. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was
my pleasure.
Really informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to turn to a panel of League of Women Voter Climate Action Guides. This is the group that they are residents of cities and they are working with the city right now. They will be introduced to you by Callie Rodolfi, who is the climate guide for Mercer Island currently. Callie?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mac. Good evening. I'm Callie Rodolfi, a climate guide for Mercer Island, and I'll be telling you how our team is beginning to develop a partnership to serve the city of Mercer Island in meeting their climate goals. For this panel, there are 3 other climate guides from other cities that will follow me in telling their brief stories as well. Jerry Gordon from Sammamish, Kathy Dormeyer of Enumclaw, and Joan Larkum of Burien. Please feel free to note any questions you might have in the Q&A section. We'll answer questions after all 4 climate guides have presented. First of all, Mercer Island, where I live, it's a bit unique. It's located, of course, on an island in the middle of Lake Washington, and it's got a population of less than 25,000 people. I-90 is our primary access, and it runs from Bellevue to Seattle across the north end of our island. Our climate team has offered the city council and the city manager our support in awareness, outreach, and engagement on climate. Our vision is that by next year at this time, every citizen of Mercer Island will know the steps they can take toward climate action. To provide you some context here, our city inventoried its greenhouse gas emissions from 2011 until 2016. Our latest source allocation for climate emissions is just 4 years old. We know that 2% of Mercer Island's emissions are from City of Mercer Island operations. For example, the city fleet and their building heat. A full 98% of emissions come from our community, our homes, our businesses, and transportation. The Mercer Island emission dashboard is posted on the city's website. Last year, our comprehensive plan was revised to include a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and a goal to develop and implement a climate action plan. Our climate goals were approved in November 2019 with the city resolution to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Some good news, with a recently announced wind power purchase agreement with Puget Sound Energy, the city operations are now powered with 100% clean energy. So how did we negotiate entry with the city? At the end of September, I sent the city council members an introduction to our project by email and made an appointment with the city clerk to make an appearance at the next city council meeting. I was given the opportunity to attend virtually, and I made a 3-minute statement during appearances on October 6th. I proposed to assist them in achieving their climate priorities, and I introduced our team as a resource for community engagement and education around climate action. We asked to meet with them to explore what a partnership might look like. 3 of our city council members attended the King County Climate Action Session on October 8th. I followed up with those city council members afterwards, asking to discuss our project further. Councilperson Reynolds met with team member Tatiana and I in early November. He suggested we follow up with the city manager, so we reached out to her with an introduction to our project and an invitation to this climate forum. Her office replied with an appreciation of our offer and suggested we reach out to the city's sustainability and communication person, which we've done. What might happen next? The city leaders are going to be setting priorities and annual work elements at their planning session at the beginning of next year. The city biennial budget will be finalized in January, and it may include a full-time sustainability staff person for the Public Works Department. While we wait for the city to develop their work plan for 2021, we will begin to work and build awareness of the climate goals. We plan to develop an engagement plan for our work to include points of engagement, methods of outreach, and key messages. We are drafting eye-catching graphics that can be used to educate our public about climate goals and meaningful actions. We've discovered through this process that most people on Mercer Island do not know that the city has climate goals. Starting from there, we're ready and able to educate and engage our public on multiple levels with a sense of urgency. Our climate team's objective is to make it clear to all Mercer Island residents the realistic and the doable changes they can make to make a difference and reduce carbon emissions. We are really honored to be part of this project. At this point, I'll turn it over to Jerry Gordon, Climate Guide for Sammamish.
Thank you, Callie. And thanks to everybody that showed up this evening. Quite clearly, climate is important to a lot of people. Now, I'm from Sammamish, and my story is a lot different than Callie's, which goes to show you that all cities are approaching this differently. And every city has a personality. Sammamish is a young city. It's only about 20 years old. It's in the foothills, and it's just north up, right above Issaquah. So how do you talk to a whole city? Well, Callie alluded to the whole approach that the league likes to call negotiating entry. Well, I think that's a really eloquent way of saying knock on the door. So I think it's easy to find a door. Every city council has a door, and it's called public comment, or it's called public input. So I decided that I would go to the website, find their meeting schedule and their process for public entry or public input, and I put my name in for the next meeting. In the meantime, I emailed the council member that I knew had gone to Seattle-King County's Climate Action Toolkit training. I'm thinking if she went to the training, she's interested. So I emailed her, introduced myself, told her that I lived in Sammamish, that I'd been there 20 years, and I was recently retired, and I wanted to work with them on their climate goals, and that I had signed up for public comment. In the meantime, after introducing myself to the council, I went to the meeting and introduced myself to the council and had just a very quick introduction and what the league's goal is. And the league is not supposed, they don't want to tell you what to do for your city. They want to help you with whatever your city has decided the plan is. And that's where the toolkit comes in handy. That's a very slick tool. So after that, I logged off and I checked my email, and sure enough, I had an email from the council member who had gone to the toolkit training saying we would love to work with the league. 3 days later, I got an email from the mayor saying the same thing. So there we are. I negotiated my entry. I knocked on the door. And before I hand this over to Kathy, I want to leave you with this thought. This is a great philosophy. There is an architect now. His name is, and he's Danish, and I'm going to mangle his name, so I apologize. His name is Bjarke Ingels. He builds climate-friendly buildings. He builds climate-friendly communities. He's doing them now all over the world. And his philosophy, and I will paraphrase, just because a plan is vast and complicated, it's not a reason not to start one. So that's what we're all doing here tonight. We're starting one. I
think she froze.
Would you like me to go next?
Yes, next we will have turn it over to Kathy Dormeyer of Enumclaw.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here tonight along with Marion Jensen, who is also one of the climate guides here in Enumclaw. I've been involved with the League for over 30 years, and I've lived here in Enumclaw for the last 20 years. And this is the first time I've had this wonderful opportunity to work so closely with community and the League. Our community here is very unique. We have about 12,000 people who live within the city limits of Enumclaw, but we're also very rural. And outside the city limits, hundreds of people live on farms, on dairies, or very large pieces of property. So we are, again, as Jerry had said, we are just very unique, each community. Negotiating entry into the city council was very easy. Went to the website, contacted the city clerk. She got me on the agenda. I emailed the 2 documents that we were asked to share, which was a letter from our president introducing us, as well as the protocols for the climate guides. And she got those out in advance of the meeting to the city council members. I made the 3-minute presentation and on their Zoom meeting, and then they also offered Marion another 3 minutes to present, which she did. And then I asked someone to contact me from the city council, whoever would be interested in working with us on creating a climate action plan for Enumclaw. They were in the throes of working on their budget at that time. And so it took about a month, but eventually City Council member Anthony Wright contacted me and said, if no one else has touched base with you, I would be happy to work with you on the climate action plan. And where do we start? So I want to give a shout out to Anthony, because this is part of where we are starting. He has joined our forum here tonight. So I really appreciate that. So we're kind of taking these steps together. We've been emailing each other back and forth. I sent him an energy efficiency grant proposal. He forwarded that to the Public Works Department. So we've been staying in contact with one another. But I do want to point out that unlike some of the other communities, we are at the very beginning stages of this process. I'd like to encourage any of the climate guides who are watching now to make sure that you research your city council's website. I did that and I found 2 very interesting documents that were insightful in this process. The first one was a 2010 proclamation to amend greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And it's the very first steps of moving in that direction. However, it's a 10-year-old plan, but at least they had that on their radar back then. But there really weren't any specific goals, objectives, or indicators of success. So that's one document that we can maybe refer to as we begin this process. Also, I found a 2014 comprehensive plan that went for 6 years. So it's going to be sunsetting this year in 2020. And it's 86 pages long. And basically it was a visioning process whereby the council took months to work with lots of community members and say, what is it we need in Enumclaw to make it a viable, strong, productive community? Kudos to Enumclaw City Council. They worked on community engagement. They involved over 600 stakeholders when they did this process on the comprehensive plan. Unfortunately, there is nothing in this document, however, that focuses on reducing greenhouse gases. So there's another opportunity for us to begin to work. So Marion and I and Councilman Anthony Wright will be starting to meet next week on Zoom and begin to develop what our next steps will be, and if we're going to work with the 2 documents that already exist, or if we are going to work on collecting greenhouse gas emissions information, or just exactly where the city council might be interested in going.
1 minute.
Thank you. Oh, I'm done. So I'm going to turn it over to Joan Larkum, who is the climate guide of Burien.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joan. It's just very interesting to me. You know, I'm the last of the four of us, and how different all our communities are. Because with Burien, it was more like getting on a train that's already moving. You're just trying to jump on, but it's not moving quickly and it could use our help, but it's still in motion. Anyway, I've only lived in Burien since 2015 and only full-time for 2 years. And I'm also new to the league. I joined them last year, and I joined the Environmental Committee just a couple of months ago. So I'm new on all 3 fronts. So I decided the safest thing to do would be to start with research, which is what I did. As Kathy just suggested, I did a lot of research on the website, looking at the city council and finding out what the members were interested in. I found at least one who had been very interested in climate action, and I wrote to that member and got an immediate response with lots of information over the next several days. I found out from her that not only was Burien a member of K4C, which Mac just explained so clearly, but it's also signed on to the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, Tree City USA, and the Fostera's Green City Partnership. So there's clearly a lot of interest in there. But as the city council member said, it all goes very slowly and involves many trips to Olympia. So while they're having done my research and contacted that one person, I got my courage up and approached the city council. But before that, I had the chance to meet with my colleagues in the cities to the south. We had a Zoom meeting and they said, first you send the letters and then you wait, and then the next meeting, then you go and make your public comments. So I had these slight guidelines, which I took. So the day came or the night came and I gave my presentation to the city council. And after I finished, because it was late, I was the last one to speak. There was no reaction at all, no clarifying questions. And I was like, I wonder what that means. And so I went home that night falling asleep and saying, now what? What do I do now? I got nothing there. But I needn't have been worried, because the next day I got 2 emails that meant a lot to me. I heard from the People for Climate Action. That's the NGO or the non-government organization that's regional to Washington, or King County, actually. It's regional to us. And it has groups in many of the cities that the league also is focusing on. So I went to a meeting of theirs at their invitation and enjoyed hearing more about them, what they do. They're doing a workbook. They've been very active in pressing for climate action. So I think that I'm happy to work with them on some of the outreach and engagement that we have planning. The second email was from an environmental consultant that works full-time in Burien. I mean, they've already jumped on the board and got an environmental consultant since last March. She works full-time, and her goal is to guide towards a climate action plan that's tentatively scheduled for next June. At the moment, she's doing a greenhouse gas inventory, which we've heard about tonight, for Burien. And when that's done, it takes about 6 months, she said. That should be done in January. And after that, then you do the modeling, or the future sort of options of what could happen with this and that changing in the climate. And then, so I did some calculation after I talked to this environmental consultant, Paige Morris. 6 months to get the baseline, 4 months possibly to get the models for the future. And then in June, there's supposed to be a completed thing. That doesn't leave much time for engagement. So I'm jumping on the bandwagon for that tomorrow. I have a Zoom call scheduled with Paige, and we plan to go over some of the ways that I can be helpful, especially with community engagement and also in places more impacted by climate change. So my basket is full of things to do. And I'm looking forward to it very much. I want to thank the league members for being so helpful to a newbie who is trying to find her way in approaching these people, and also to Mac, who's given us good guidance. It's going to be a challenge because it's more diverse than some of the cities that we've talked about tonight. So there are many different language groups are here also. So we have to be be quite broad in the way we approach the community. Thanks very much for letting me speak about this tonight. I'm done.
Well, thank you, Jerry, Kathy, Joan. We will entertain some questions from the participants. And at this time, we do have a question that's come up. Exactly how were the greenhouse gas emissions measured?
That's a good question.
It is a great question, and I can answer it very basically in terms of what I know about Mercer Islands, and perhaps Rachel can follow up with how the county measured the greenhouse gas emissions. In the case of Mercer Island, I guess it may be a little simpler than for the county because we comprise one zip code. And so there's data that would come from Puget Sound Energy, who provides our gas and electricity for the 98040 zip code. And that can be translated using emission factors into how much carbon that represents. In the case of our vehicle miles traveled, that's VMT, if you ever hear that term, it means vehicle miles traveled. And that can translate into, from gas usage, what the carbon emitted from small vehicles as well as trucks. That information actually for us came from Puget Sound Regional Council, who has developed a model. Then the city has things like pump stations that take electricity. And that's actually a large amount of electricity that can be translated into carbon. And then also solid waste is another contributing factor to carbon emissions. But anyway, it is an accounting process. It involves a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of different data coming in, a lot of different emission factors to convert that to carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So that's how it's done for Mercer Island, and it takes time. But perhaps Rachel would like to answer that question for the county.
Thanks, Callie. Our methodology is very similar, just probably more elements and on a larger scale. Same thing, we work with our utilities to understand what the countywide consumption is of electricity and natural gas. We have both City Light, which is a very clean source, and Puget Sound Energy, which is a much more fossil fuel heavy source. And then we look at the natural gas. Same as Callie said, we use driving and vehicle mile estimates from the Puget Sound Regional Council. And then we do look at the different operations from wastewater, which does consume an amazing amount. We also consider agriculture related emissions. We use, there's certain accepted protocols out there so that is standardization. We use the US Community Protocol and that helps guide estimates and how one might account for things. So there is definitely some consistency and some rigor in how we go about our estimates.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's see, not having any, well, we do, I think a question just came in here. What are some thoughts about really helping raise the awareness of community members? A lot of community members might not care or might not know about climate action. So what are your thoughts, panelists, on really helping raise the awareness of your community members? Jerry?
I'm thinking that's probably everybody's first question, because the community is what we want the input from. And so I think that's where the league can excel. And every city, of course, has a pool of talents, just like all of the league members have pools of talents. So I think it's very hard to say one recipe will fit every city. I think each climate guide could be helpful in suggesting anywhere from social media to old-fashioned flyers to email blasts. That would be something that a climate guide would be perfect in working with the city council with, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kathy, do you have anything to share on that?
Well, I would say maybe doing surveys or finding some way for people to give input to what their practices are, or behaviors that they can begin to think about changing to affect the reduction of greenhouse gases. And so if you're involved or in a focus group, things that Rachel was referring to earlier, ways that you can get people engaged in communicating with one another. And if we can't do it face to face, we can, do it on Zoom. But really trying to find ways that people will take seriously, beginning to think about the things that they're purchasing or the driving that they do, or alternatives that they can come up with that when they're doing this process that will help them change individual behaviors, which will help us all.
That's something else. I liked the part of the toolkit where it talks about the cities can first, let's face it, money is a lot of it because all the cities are doing their budgets. And the first thing they have to think of is how to spend their money. One of my favorite parts of the toolkit was that you can pick what maybe looks nice and price it out. And if that doesn't work, then you can price something else out. It was a way for the cities to look at what the people want and then balance it with the kind of return on investment. And I thought that would be a great compromise between the public and what they're willing to do and the city and what they can afford to do. And surely there would be able to be a meeting ground in the middle.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, we had a question come in from a resident of Lake Forest Park, which has a strong commitment to preserving tree canopy and preservation of open space. How does this get included in the calculation of our climate baseline? Of course, planting more trees and preservation of open space will help to reduce carbon emissions. That's a general answer. Perhaps Rachel or another panelist could answer more fully.
So I'll try to take a stab at this. I will just put a disclaimer that I am not a highly skilled technician on the nuts and bolts of all carbon emissions inventories, but I believe that there's more methodology on how you actually capture the on per tree or per acre value of the of your canopy. I would, what I could do is I could ask folks at the county that are more aligned with our 30-year forest plan and our land conservation initiative to better understand how they account for that. And I could respond to Mac or to you directly with that information. I would be making something up if I talked about right now, but I know that there's a lot of work, and the county has actually started a forest carbon credit program that whereby we sell offsets from some of the actually very highly productive and highly they store a lot of carbon in the forests in the Pacific Northwest. And we've actually have 2 clients, one of which is Microsoft, which buys offsets from our carbon program. But I'd be happy to follow up with a response to this.
I can get it to the Lake Forest Park person, so.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the panel. This is not easy work. And we're knocking on doors, and I said, there are no closed doors. There are just some doors are open on a crack, and others a little bit more, and others are wide open. So we're bringing ourselves into this work, and that's why we use the term negotiating entry, because it is a soft negotiation to get in, and a lot of research and study and conversation goes into it. So I want to thank the panel for their hard work and their great presentations, and especially Callie for organizing this and keeping track of it for us. Thank you so much. Now, there is one city that has worked for 5 years on democratic engagement of their diverse public. And they're trying to ensure, and they are ensuring, some positive climate outcomes already. They are an important role model for all of our cities. So I'm going to introduce the two folks who will present that to you. And it is none other than the city of Shoreline. And we have Autumn Salamack, who has worked as the Environmental Services Coordinator with the city of Shoreline since March of 2019. She develops and coordinates implementation of the city's environmental sustainability and climate action programs, and has partnered with us to ensure democratic sustainability. She's a wonderful partner. We're so glad to work with her. And Lee Keim, who resides in Shoreline and is the League of Women Voters Climate Action Guide, working with Autumn there. And Lee is also a very active member of our environmental committee. So I'm going to turn it over to Autumn, and she's going to lead with some slides, and then Lee is going to follow with some commentary. There will be questions and answers. I know you're going to have a lot of questions on this. Please note the question and answer function is at the bottom on the right, and enter them all the way through the presentation, which is about 20 minutes long. Okay, Autumn, take it away.
Hey, well, good evening, and thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's a real honor. Next slide. As Mac mentioned, I work on environmental sustainability and climate change programs in Shoreline, and I wanted to share a little bit about our climate action journey and how we're working to create a more democratic process in our community. Next slide. So we'll start with where we've been. Next. Our climate journey has been underway for about 15 years in the city of Shoreline. We signed the US Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, vowing to reduce carbon emissions back in 2006, adopted an environmental sustainability strategy in 2008, joined the King County Cities Climate Collaboration as a founding member in 2011, and adopted our first climate action plan in 2013. Next. To create our climate action plan, a staff member in our planning department spent several months gathering data on things like building electricity and natural gas use and vehicle fuel use and miles traveled in order to create a carbon emissions inventory, which you're hopefully all more familiar with after tonight. That inventory allowed us to see where most of our emissions were coming from in the community and to develop a series of recommended actions that the city, residents, and businesses could take to help reduce those emissions moving forward. Next. While the 2013 Climate Action Plan was developed before my time at the city, it appears that the plan was really developed by a consultant and city staff with fairly limited input from residents. You may have heard about the spectrum of public engagement, which is shown here. At one end, you have information really being shared. You're informing people about what you're doing and asking them for some basic feedback. At the opposite end, you have people empowered to actually help develop and own that plan. Back in 2013, we were really on the inform and consult end of that spectrum. A consultant worked with city staff to develop a draft plan, which was then shared at one public meeting at City Hall. Next. Fast forward a few years, and we see that a lot has changed in terms of how government is both expected to engage the community in planning efforts and what resources we as a city can put towards this effort now compared to 2013. When I started in March of 2019, I saw that we would need to update our climate action plan again soon, and that we'd need to start laying a good foundation for a different kind of community engagement. Despite the pandemic, we were thankfully able to use 2020 to really hone in on community conversations and programs, specifically talking about climate action to lay the groundwork for that next step. Next. It can be overwhelming trying to decide what the most important and realistic actions are to fight climate change. We wanted to make that a little easier with the Shoreline Climate Challenge, an online platform that helps people learn about which actions can make the biggest climate impact based on their home energy use, diet, type of transportation, and more. Participants earn points for completing different actions that can reduce emissions, lower utility bills, and improve comfort and health. They also learn about community scale solutions to advocate for in their cities. Next. We did a lot of work to engage the community in this program, starting by reaching out to known active community groups and individuals with an interest in the environment. We asked for their input as we developed the program and for their support as we rolled it out to the broader community. It's easy to start conversations with people you already know have an interest in the environment, and they can definitely be great partners. However, we know that we need everyone in our community playing a part in our climate program, not just those who have an interest in environmental issues, if we want it to be successful. To that end, we created a broad list of all community groups who might have an interest in community building, public health, green jobs, and lowering utility bills to identify new partners. We sent this postcard to all households in the city and did a lot of promotion online, in our community newsletters, and with personalized calls and presentations for everyone from local faith groups to the Rotary Club and the Chamber of Commerce. Next. From late June to October, over 300 households participated in the challenge, completing more than 1,000 actions that reduce air pollution, lower utility bills, and support local green jobs. We exceeded our initial participation goals, even with the pandemic and no in-person presentations or events, and we saw a lot of great community dialogue taking place on the challenge website, which we considered a great success. Next. We were successful in large part because we had some really energetic and active community members participating in the challenge. We encouraged people to form teams of 8 to 10 households and measured points earned by each team for committing to take different actions, community groups, and different neighborhoods in the city to promote some friendly competition. Next. As you can see, the winning team, the Baha'is of Shoreline, had some fun when we asked them for a safe group photo. We publicly recognized our top teams at a November City Council meeting and in our community newsletters. We think it's really important to publicly acknowledge participants to help create some social norms around climate action and also to make it a fun community program. Next. Our second climate focus in 2020 was our Climate Champions webinar series. We worked with Washington State University to adapt their Snohomish County Sustainable Stewards program to a new online format with information specific to Shoreline. I really wanted to offer this program to help educate our community about the core areas of climate focus that were identified in our 2013 Climate Action Plan, and to set the stage for future conversations with the community about where we should focus limited resources for climate action. Next. We marketed this as a free 7-week climate change education and action webinar series, and we're able to pull in local and national speakers to talk about everything from the basics of climate change and sources of carbon emissions to why we need to think about equitable climate action, which communities are most vulnerable to climate change, and what the most effective ways are to communicate your climate message with different audiences. The webinar series was designed to create a base level understanding of climate change issues and opportunities, and to identify individual champions we could work with as we update our climate action plan and develop new programs moving forward. We had more than 60 people attend each session, and there were quite a few people who attended the entire 7-week series. While the majority of participants were from Shoreline, we had registrations from more than 20 communities in the region and one from California, and made the webinar recordings available on our website for anyone to watch. Next. Which brings me to where we're going. Next slide. Next year, we'll be measuring our carbon emissions again to see how much progress we've made since 2016 and where we need to focus our efforts in the next 5 to 10 years. We plan to start updating our climate action plan next summer and to work with the community to prioritize actions to both reduce future carbon emissions and prepare our community for climate impacts in an equitable manner. This will be a great opportunity to dive into what priority community level solutions we really want to target in Shoreline and to take a new approach to community engagement. Next. As I mentioned earlier, our 2013 Climate Action Plan had some community engagement, but it really landed on the inform end of the public engagement spectrum. My goal for our 2021 plan update is at minimum to move to the involve stage and ideally work our way to empowering equitable community engagement. We don't have a lot of staff resources at the city, and we don't have any citizen environmental committees. but we do have a real interest in a democratic process for developing this plan and for centering that plan around equity. That will likely include the formation of a new public advisory committee with targeted representation from youth and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. We really want to engage community members who A, could be most vulnerable to climate change, and B, don't automatically come to the table when we start talking about environmental issues. We need to make sure that all of our community demographics are represented in this conversation, and that we're not only hearing from people who have the time, resources, and automatic interest to come and talk about climate change. We also need to look at how we compensate people for their contributions and time in this discussion, which could include things like paying a stipend to committee participants or providing childcare and interpreters. The goal is not to have city staff come to the community and say, here's the plan that we've developed, what do you think? But to have the community really help us develop that plan, helping us to identify and prioritize actions, voicing support for the future resources that will be needed to implement this plan, and feeling like they own the plan, and that our youth and our most marginalized community members had a real opportunity to help shape it. That's not a small goal, and it's not an area where government has always excelled, but I'm optimistic that we'll move in the right direction on the spectrum. And I'm also optimistic that we'll put that new King County Climate Action Toolkit to good use and be able to successfully work with Lee to ensure a robust and equitable community engagement platform. Next. One way we've been able to really engage the community in taking action to fight climate change is with our environmental mini grant program. The city provides up to $5,000 in grant funds to individuals, community groups, and business owners for projects that enhance the environment and promote environmental stewardship. Those projects must occur in areas deemed for public use, provide a tangible and measurable public benefit to the environment and community, and address one of the focus areas noted on the slide, which align with our current environmental goals set by City Council. Next. We only have $15,000 available each year for these grants, but the community has been able to do some pretty great work over the past 13 years. Since 2007, the Environmental Mini Grant Program has awarded over $200,000 for 57 community grants. This year, we funded 4 projects that included remote classroom presentations on climate change and helping the community group Climate Action Shoreline print additional copies of their Working Together Every Day to Make a Change educational brochure. Next. We're also working on how to really highlight that great work by our community members and released our first ever sustainability report this past spring. The report highlights projects and programs completed by the city and community members, along with metrics tracking our progress to goals we've set for fighting climate change, reducing waste, expanding bicycle trails, and more. It's really important to communicate your goals and your progress in meeting them. It's important for the community to know what's going well and what might need a new approach or more resources, especially if you want to keep them engaged. We'll be sharing our 2020 annual sustainability report early next year, so you can keep an eye out for that. Next. Shoreline is a smaller city, and we don't have staffing or budgets on par with the county or the city of Seattle. It's really just me and one other employee who went from part-time to full-time this year, who specifically work on environmental sustainability. And we are responsible for managing a pretty big portfolio of work that covers everything from managing our solid waste contract to leading grant-funded programs to reduce pollution to coordinating implementation of our Salmon Safe certification for improved water quality. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the amount of work to be done at the municipal level, but we know that time is of the essence when it comes to climate action. So using new tools like the Climate Action Toolkit and having conversations with the community about how climate change is more than just an environmental issue is so important for all of us. Identifying diverse community partners and establishing strong relationships to facilitate effective community engagement is also critical, as we can't do this work alone. Now, you can learn more about all of our city sustainability and climate change programs on our website or by sending me an email anytime. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Keim, our Shoreline Climate Guide.
Thank you very much, Autumn. Good evening. My name is Lee Kime, and I am one of the League and Women Voter Climate Guides for Shoreline. I've lived in this city for 32 years, and I'll have to say, it's only recently I've paid attention to what we have here in the city and how the city has made a strong commitment to addressing climate change. Ever since incorporation, the city just 25 years ago, sustainability and protection of the natural environment has been part of the framework goals of the city. I've had some opportunity in the last couple of years to study the city climate action goals and their comprehensive plan, and understand that it's a rare thing for a city of this size to have a staff. You know, the environmental department services with the staff is rare for a city of this size. Shoreline has committed to utilizing the Climate Action Toolkit, Autumn has told me, and is seeking to diverse public input when updating their climate action plan next year. I'm very pleased to say that from our very first meeting, Autumn has been wonderful to work with. She's invited our volunteers to work with her and together to achieve the goals that they've decided the city will enter into. The facts remain, though, despite strong climate policies by Shoreline and other cities, as Rachel mentioned earlier, the current data shows much more work is needed to reduce community-wide emissions in order to meet the emission reduction targets by 2030. You saw this chart earlier that Mac presented to us, and it's not looking so good right now. There's really a lot of work that needs to be done. So in light of this, our volunteers with the League have been preparing themselves to assist the cities in becoming familiar with the Climate Action Plan and the Toolkit. We have researched each of our cities' environmental policies. We have sought out the environmental allies within the government, on the councils and with the city staff, to find them to work with us to advocate for adopting effective, democratic, and equitable climate initiatives into their climate environmental plans. What our volunteers can offer is our home knowledge of where we live and deep engagement with our communities. As Autumn has mentioned, it's important to search out to the youth in our communities, our social and religious organizations, neighborhood leaders, and particularly marginalized communities who are experience the worst of the climate issues. In order to facilitate discussions of the severity of climate repercussions for humans and the natural environment, these discussions are critically important to reach out to our communities. We need honest discussions, meeting people where they are and based on shared values, by offering positive actions that individuals can take to imagine themselves as part of the solution and willing to engage in meeting this, which is the greatest challenge of our times. And therein lies a culture shift necessary for all of us to become climate champions and together find a sustainable path for future generations and this planet that we call home. Thank you.
All right, Lee, thank you. Autumn, thank you. Great presentations. We have a couple minutes here for some questions. There is a viewer who is curious about what community groups Shoreline felt like they had the most successful working relationships with, and why those smaller communities were so successful in partnering for climate change.
Yeah, so I've been with the city for almost 2 years, and 1 year of that was during unusual pandemic times. So my experience is somewhat limited, but most of the community groups that I've worked with have been through the environmental mini grant programs. So we have a couple of individuals who do, contracting for the school district on climate education, Dig in Shoreline is a local gardening and food nonprofit, which has been very active in both providing on the ground projects and doing education and outreach events. So those are two that we've worked with quite a bit. I will say, going through the Shoreline Climate Challenge, we just had a really good response from some of our local churches and faith groups, which there's some natural alignment there with looking at climate action and sort of community health. We've also had some good participation from the Rotary Club and from the Chamber of Commerce in particular. They were active participants in providing some incentives for the climate challenge as well.
And how do you address the lack of technical knowledge in terms of climate change terminology, or just being familiar with the science behind it in the community, about what is making the most difference for the climate, so that you're choosing, energy efforts that are effective in the long run, but also that the community can get involved in?
Well, starting with by having a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, that helped us identify that most of our emissions are coming from transportation and building energy use. And most of our energy use comes from electricity from Seattle City Light, which Rachel mentioned is essentially a carbon neutral utility. So it's really been useful for us to say, if we really want to take aggressive climate action in Shoreline, it's transportation and it's our building stock. So that's sort of our starting standpoint. With the climate challenge, we were able to say, okay, if you live in an electric heated home, or if you live in a natural gas heated home, now you can actually you can select individual actions based on your home energy profile to see what it would cost for you to upgrade, for example, to an electric heat pump. What would that cost you? What sort of annual savings would you see? And what other benefits would you see for your household in terms of improved comfort or improved health as well? So we really tried to use the challenge platform as a way for people to, if they can, get over the slight technological hurdle of creating an account and logging on, to then really be able to see exactly what a difference each individual action would make based on their individual home energy profile.
Great. And I have another question for the both of you. So someone commented that these are amazing programs that you were talking about, but it seems inefficient to have every city developing these programs independently. And so this portion of the webinar here is really focused on individual city efforts and what they've been doing. But this person is asking, how can we work together to create region-wide programs? And so is that a part of what you're doing, Autumn, in your work with City of Shoreline? And then Lee, maybe you want to speak a little bit about how it goes back to the league.
Yeah, so I will say that for the Climate Champions webinar series, when we were going to have that in person, we were going to limit it to 20 people from Shoreline. Once we were forced to do it remotely, it really opened up a whole new world of possibilities for us. And so we said, anybody can come. And that was great because, like I said, we had over 20 different local municipalities participating. And that's not a problem from our perspective. We're always happy to get the word out to other cities and let them know that we're hosting this type of webinar series. We also work really closely with other K4C city members, and we're always looking for opportunities to either replicate existing programs or existing materials from one another, or to start having these conversations about, can we partner up together to do a more regional webinar series, for example. And
I'd like to comment that I am working with the 5 cities up here in District 1 of King County. We meet together and we once a week we talk about how are we doing in each of our cities up here. We share ideas, and I often share what's happening in Shoreline, to give everybody an idea of, where their cities could possibly improve their climate policies. So this is a widening of the the information, per district. And that's the way the league has set us up. We're in individual cities, but we have groups of us that are covering all the 9 districts of King County.
Thank you. I am not sure how we're doing on time, so we might have time for one more question. There is a specific question about, is tree canopy a part of your bigger picture for Shoreline? And what is the percentage now? And do you have a goal for increasing that percentage?
It is a part of our conversation in terms of talking about carbon sinks, although I would say it's a broader conversation about having a healthy, sustainable community and providing amenities beyond just the climate benefits. The last number I saw was that our tree canopy had increased 21% from 2009 to 2018. And I believe the next assessment for the forest canopy is due within a couple of years. So I don't know if we have a specific percentage goal, but trees certainly play an important role for many different reasons in our community.
One of the things that's happening here in Shoreline is that we've got the link rails coming in, 2 large stations. And unfortunately, there were a lot of trees that were taken down as we're getting those rails put in place. But they did commit to replacing a multiple number of trees for every one that they take down. So that is a concern with some citizens in Shoreline. Trees are very important to us, and we're watching that pretty carefully. But I know that the city has assured that these trees will be replaced, as well as sound transit. So that's a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Autumn. I think that's going to conclude our question session, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mac.
And I want to thank the Shoreline team for the 3 of you for a great delivery. The work you're doing has been documented in this presentation. It will be shown on King County TV, and long after this webinar ends, you'll be up there. And I think it will do a great service to some of the other cities who are wondering how to get past that sort of tight little group of supporters around the city council, who has done, these people have done a great job keeping the city focused, but spreading it out now democratically and making sure that it's equitable, and making sure that these cities get a network opportunity or 2 is really where the future lies for this work. So I want to thank you tremendously. I also would like to close with, I always reinforce that the whole time, the whole 8 months we were working on this, we kept coming back to the League of Women Voters mission and the values, and we kept trying to figure out how our role could be aligned carefully with our values and with the needs of the cities. And this quote, this is the mission for the Seattle King County League of Women Voters. And I just put in a few words to express our alignment. So the mission says we should be encouraging informed and active participation in government. And for this project, it's city government, working to increase understanding of major public policy issues. In this instance, it's climate, and influencing public policy, carbon emissions through education and advocacy. So if we get the attention and the distributed attention of a lot of residents of various communities, as Shoreline is getting, I believe that is the path to sustainability for the climate work, because it's only when people change their behaviors that they're willing to work at a higher level, at a policy level, at a voting level statewide. I can see all kinds of possibilities for Washington State coming out of these small projects. So thank you all so much for this evening, and for the team who helped us with their tech support. We so appreciate you. And at the bottom of this slide, it's all the places where you can go back. There'll be a recording of this eventually, I believe, on YouTube later, not immediately. King County TV will be featuring us a little bit later. I don't know how much later. And Facebook streamed us live. And if you have questions about the Environment Committee or the Climate Action Guide project, you can email me at that email address and I'll respond. So thank you all for a very full, beautiful evening. And I wish you all the best tonight as you disappear into the darkness. Thank you. Thank you.